Thank you, and happy Thanksgiving. Probably from my accent, you can tell I'm not from Dublin. I'm actually from Cork. Really? My great-grandfather. But anyway, so I'd like to talk about offensive countermeasures, and this is going to be something completely different. As I listened to the speakers today, we talked a lot about what do CISOs do, how do we think as humans, all those kind of things, and we're kind of tied into the same thing when we think about offensive countermeasures, and that's really, I think, the conversation will fit very, very nicely into everything else that's gone on. It also is, I think, very poetic that I'm followed by somebody who's going to tell you how to rob banks. So this should be quite fun. But first, I'd like to start with some unnatural acts. There are basic unnatural acts that we don't do as an industry, and that is we don't collaborate that well. We don't talk to each other that well. We don't share a lot. And I think one of the speakers earlier this morning said we really need, I think it was Brian actually, we need to start sharing far more, collaborating far more as an industry so that we can become better. And we're really not doing well, actually. That definition of insanity, we embody that definition of insanity. But before I start, there's a disclaimer. The disclaimer is, guys, some of the things I'm going to talk about could get you in trouble. And so because it is things that could get you in trouble, before you start on the journey that I'm going to talk about, present, make sure you talk to your legal department, make sure you talk to your HR department, make sure you talk to multiple people inside the organization to get the clearance to move into these areas. And I hope you enjoy some of the humor in some of the slides as we go through it. We try to put a little bit of jabs in there. So our current strategies aren't working. We know that. We see it all the time. Brian used this early this morning. I think several of the speakers used the same thing about insanity. But if you think about it, 5 years ago, what were we told to do inside of cybersecurity? Patch, right? Put in AV. How's that working for us? It's not working so well. So we're saying the same thing today, and I think we need to make a shift. And some of the shift has to do with us changing how we think about cybersecurity altogether. What is cybersecurity? So the skills that we're going to talk about are really about taking back security, taking back the capabilities inside of our organization. Somebody who attacks us is actually a target for us to go after. And actually, we can start thinking about using the same skills that hackers use against us, against the attackers. Now, I'm not talking about blue screen of death for somebody attacking us, because there's a high probability when we try to attack back in that fashion, we're going to hurt the wrong person. It's not going to be the person who's actually attacking. So what we are talking about is what we can do inside of our own environments to make this a lot better. What we do know altogether is that only 10% of the hacks are found by our internal tools. That means 90% of the hacks are discovered by somebody else, and we learn about it after the fact. So obviously our systems aren't being built or not built for us finding the hacks. It's actually not functioning well. I would propose to you that this is not about technology. Cybersecurity is about something else. And we'll talk about the something else. So if you think about what's happening on the outside world, how many AV companies, how many cybersecurity, there's a lot more today than there were a year ago, but how many companies are out there? Who are the biggest? How do they function? If somebody was to go to a big cybersecurity company, I think the presenter just before me from Canon was saying that the companies aren't all that great when it comes to their products, but somebody goes to one of those companies and said, look, I'm from a criminal enterprise. I'd like to have a copy of your software because I'm really worried about advanced persistent threats. Would he get sold that copy of software? Of course. So we have an unbalanced playing field. They have copies of what we have, and the attackers are more funded or better funded than some of the defenders. if you think about your adversaries, do they have the ability to bypass some of our technologies? Absolutely. Because if you think about the pen testers, and how many pen testers are out there? Pen testing companies? There's at least one. So is it ridiculously easy to get through the defenses that we have today? Has anybody had a pen test that the pen testers were not able to get through? That's crickets. So the fact is, if you think about it, why would the attackers not be able to exploit the same thing that pen testers do? So I don't think of any organization is able to mount the defenses that they need to mount based upon purely technology. So why do we go through the problem? Well, one of the easiest ways, why do we go through the trouble of doing the offensive countermeasures? It's one of the easiest ways for an attacker to get in is by blending in. We get 1 million events per day on our firewalls. 1 million events per day. That translates into about 2% into incidents. You can do the math. That's significant. So 1 million events per day. Where do you think most of the incidents lie? Do they lie on the things that the technology says is a critical incident, or do you think it's in the informational area? And it's actually the informational area. It's the blending in. It's the SSH. It's the things that you would expect to see. So the firewall says this is informational, but it's really not put out there as an incident. This is where we're finding a lot of our problems. So blending in is what the attackers tried to do. This is how they get through. And any pen tester will tell you that's what they tried. So our journey was, it's not about revenge. It's not about the blue screen of death to somebody. It's really about, well, it's not even hacking back. Well, maybe a little bit of hacking back. But it is about taking the offensive, and it's not about technology and taking offenses. It's about having a strategy, thinking about processes, people first, and then somewhere along the line you think about the technologies that have to be put in place. So when you think about the strategy, it's about thinking about using hacker techniques against them. Could get you in legal trouble. There are some things that you can use to avoid. One of the things is warning banners. So beyond everything else, talking to the legal department, make sure that you have warning banners put inside your system to let the hacker know that there's traps inside of your organization. Now, will that prevent the hacker from hacking? Absolutely not. But the warning banners have to be there so that they're warned. There's really good case law indicating that you cannot have a lethal trap for somebody without warning them first. So the warning banners are need to be explicit. They need to be able to tell people exactly what to expect. Actually, what could go wrong is if you put your malware, accessible malware, in an easy place, there's no warnings before you get to it. You set up recursive directory searches in places where anybody can get to. Those areas would cause you to get into legal problem. So it's really about us carefully putting together our systems to get the strategic outcomes, and I'll talk about that in a second. And so our focus really on annoyance, attribution, and in some cases, attacking back. So back to warning banners. So some signs aren't going to work. There are some signs that get better. So when you start thinking about a warning banner, it's more explicit. And then really, from our perspective, our warning banners need to be talking about the system. So telling people that they shouldn't get into the system, that they're not authorized, that there may be problems, that they may cause damage to their systems. So we started not at the crown jewels, but instead we started looking from the attacker's perspective. There's only 3 vectors of attack. There's email, there's unpatched vulnerabilities, and there is insiders. Now, I know that sounds simplistic, but at the end, that's the 3 attack vectors. When it gets to email, the biggest attack vector in email is trying to steal your credentials. Guys, name.name@domain.com and a password is so 1960. It was obsolete then, it is still obsolete. When you think about it, this is ridiculously easy for people. When Brian does his attacks, red team attacks against my organization, he's going for those credentials because those credentials are how he morphs into domain administration control, how he gets into the organization and can get into damage. This is 80% of the email attacks. The other percentage of email attacks, 20 or some odd percent, is about delivery mechanisms for things that affect your system. So this would be unpatched vulnerabilities or new types of malware that can get inside the system. Vulnerabilities, we don't really control for vulnerabilities. We had a speaker earlier today talk about putting in controls, patching your systems. How many of you guys work with your installation and operations people and they have a very, very good patch management system? Anybody? Outstanding. So most people don't, and that unpatched systems are what causes a significant problem. And then insiders are our last threat. Small population, enormous amount of damage. So our strategy, we created a strategy. The strategy was really focused around the 3 attack vectors. So how about if we start denying the attackers some of the principal ways that they get in the system. So our strategy looked at capabilities. And by the way, this is not technology, but these are capabilities. First one is multi-factor authentication and identity and access management, so all applications are controlled from a central source. So if you think about that, I've denied an enormous amount of attack surface to the hackers who are trying to get in the system. They can't steal the domain administration. When we pass information, when I do authentication in the system, the authentication is with the certificate on the back end. By the way, did I say this was going to be a technical presentation? How many of you guys are technical versus non-technical? Technical? Oh, God, thanks. All right. So on the multi-factor authentication, what's created is a certificate, not a hash. So there is no pass the hash. And multi-factor authentication does not have to be that complicated. It can be a derived credential sitting on the machine. It's things that you can do that's just not that hard, nor is it that expensive. Tied to the identity and access management system, that means that all applications are centrally controlled off that same multi-factor authentication route. So you have central control when a user is provisioned and deprovisioned. And then lastly, you put an enterprise level GRC on it so you can control what happens and have forensics on what happened inside the system. The second area from a capability is having an ITASM, so an asset management and service management tool. Capability to make sure that you have a database of all of your assets, because if you don't know what all your assets are, new assets can show up. And this is software or hardware, and you'll never know it. So knowing what you have means you can also exclude what you should not have inside the system. And those type of anomalies are things you can catch very, very quickly. And as, like I said, it's both on software and hardware, plus it allows you to control for the vulnerabilities. The service management tool, advanced service management tool, allows you to have automation behind controlling those vulnerabilities. We work in an FDA validation system. FDA validation is a scary word. Every time we make a change to our systems, we have to revalidate. But if you don't have a good process to do that, you sometimes never revalidate your systems. Next element is having active defense. Now, active defense to me is fundamentally having a SOC with real people inside of it and really intelligent people inside of it that are taking actions against the people that are trying to intrude inside the system, and actually building new systems so that we can do some of the automation I'll show you in a little bit. Next generation firewalls are really critical from a capability. Controlling for insiders is a critical capability. We talked about change management and risk control. So these are the capabilities needed to have the basis, the foundation for offensive countermeasures. And so we asked ourselves, how do hackers do what they do? We asked, what if we did it to them? And we started small. So you'll love this. This is a pictorial diagram of what a system would look like using those particular technologies. So what you're looking at is from the internet, you have internet egress points. So you think about business network sitting below the internet egress points, and that would be the firewalls you see up at the top. Below that, you have additional firewalls for those things that you want to protect that have greater interest to the organization, greater value to the organization. So it could be your manufacturing networks, it could be your ERP systems, but they sit below secondary firewalls. In doing that, I can control how people transit inside the organization. And by the way, guys, you've got to think about your inside network, that business network, as a hostile environment, because it is. So having the additional firewalls allows you to have perception or sight into that. The other thing that we did is we said, is there a reason that any user should directly access Office 365 or any SaaS application? Can you think of a good reason? Exfiltrate data? When you think about it, if they're not inside of your security system, they can use that capability to do something different. So we have it set up so the user, when they're on an iPhone, iPad, or any device, will automatically, the minute they connect to a network, they go to Starbucks, they make an internet connection, they're automatically put on the VPN without their knowledge, which means they're always on the business network, which means that the stuff I have in the middle here, in the DMZ, that stuff in that middle layer is always in play. So now I can do some really interesting things. So for instance, all email has to transit through our defensive layers. That means I can control what emails come in and come out. I can do fine-grained control on that, and I can start doing something very interesting where I can have the emails that are coming through that I have determined are attack. I can route those emails to somewhere else. So what if you route that email to another Exchange server that sits over here off of that VLAN in that particular layer, and then in that Exchange server, you respond back to the person, this is not a valid email address, but for a company directory, click here. And they click there for a company directory. You harvest their IP address. More importantly, you can give them a new email address for that person. So somebody sends robert.jameson@mallinckrodt.com, that they're looking for that person, right? And it's a spoofed email. They put in Robert Jamieson in the company directory. They get bob.a.jameson@mnk.com. And now, from there on out, that attacker starts interacting with that email server, and they're no longer inside of our environment. They're no longer attacking or interacting with the actual user. And then what if you put in, on top of that, a botnet? So the Microsoft botnet, you put a chatbot. So the email comes in from the attacker, and you have a response going back to that attacker saying, who are you? And the chatbot can do this forever. So the idea here is looking at this attack vector, email, and shunting it off so it's no longer part of the noise of the system. The other part of this allows us to think about deceiving attackers from the outside by building up a deception layer. This is a complete deception layer, a replica of everything inside of our DMZ, everything inside of our infrastructure, a replica that sits out in this layer. So if I have Shodan scanning my environment, I shunt them to that area, and I spoof back a response so that Shodan thinks that they're in my real environment. And then I can open up ports in that environment. I can make it interesting. And my SOC spends more time doing that, but think about how much noise all of a sudden you reduce in the system. Lastly, if you think about insiders in this context, insiders, the insider threat is more about psychology than it is about technology. So in this context, I can have a pop-up happen anytime an insider, somebody inside the organization, tries to go to Dropbox, Box, puts a USB drive into their machine with a memory device. The pop-up says, this is prohibited by company policy. Do you have your manager's permission to proceed? If they hit the radio button, yes, I start collecting the PCAP data on everything that goes on, and I send the email to their manager. Now think about that. You plugged in a memory device, your manager receives the email, and they come up and say, Bob, what are you doing? How long will you continue doing that if you don't have manager permission? So it eliminates an enormous amount of noise and puts a lot of controls in place so that you can start controlling for some of the threat factors we talked about. The other thing we had in that layer is a thing called RETA. So we jettisoned, I've had 3 SIMs in my tenure as a CISO with multiple companies. We've had 3 SIMs, Logarithm, Alien Vault, and Splunk. We just jettisoned Splunk and we put in Bro and Elk, so we'd have a database and Elasticsearch, and we're writing our own scripts for how we think about alerts. But more importantly, we put RETA in. RETA is a tool from Black Hills Information Security. It's a very, very cool tool. It provides information about beaconing. So here's an interesting story. So we have this factory somewhere in Europe, won't mention where. And we ran RETA, what RETA is looking at is the PCAP data coming from all the different endpoints, and we see this beaconing. A beaconing is when a computer is at some sort of frequency going out to an IP address with very, very low level type of activity in the kilobytes, right? Carbon-based life forms don't do that. Just saying, carbon-based life forms do not every 5 minutes beacon out to something with 60 kilobytes of information. So we found that out there, and oh, dang. So we were able to find that beaconing activity. By the way, this is not a nice GUI. This is not one of the slick things you see with somebody's product. This is on the rough edge, but it works really well. So we found this beaconing computer out there in this factory, and we found an artifact on it that had no signature. How cool is that? So we turned it in. It now has a signature, but we were able to find things that you can't find any other fashion. So it's using tools that are outside the norm. RETA happens to be part of that. My cursor didn't like that. So I have a philosophy that guys, when we hear from our vendor community that we have artificial intelligence, we're going to use artificial intelligence to support machine learning, to support your particular operation, it's false. We have artificial stupidity right now, but it's not artificial intelligence. So we don't look for those type of solutions. So our whole concept was going about this differently. Now, I did put technology out there. So we put firewalls, we looked at some technology that works and provides us some of the protection. Then we layered onto it other stuff. And so the other stuff that we layered on is what is interesting about this talk, which I think I have 10 minutes left to do. So it's populating things inside of this environment that we just constructed, that I just showed you, that's in the honeypot area. Things like Honey Badger. If you haven't played with Honey Badger, look up ADHD from Black Hills Information Security. You can pull some of these tools down. Honey Badger allows you to geolocate an attacker if they open up an attachment that you've salted with something within 3 meters. That's pretty cool. And it gives you their IP address and a few other things. Just a note from my sponsor, legal sponsor. You got to be careful, got to talk to people. You can't hide what you're doing. You have to talk to the legal department and other people inside your organization. So honeypots are used to be used for research purposes, but they can be put in production. And the interesting thing about honeypots is you can do several different things. So honeyports, honey directories, there's several different things you can do with it. If properly constructed, somebody touching a honey port, somebody touching a honey document, somebody touching one of these artifacts in your system, they are an attacker. There's no doubt. There's no guesswork on it. They are an attacker if they're getting into those environments. So on production, basically it's not doing without those other technologies, but it's layering this in with those other technologies to get much more fine-grained detection on the attackers that are inside your system or are trying to get inside of your system. So one of the honeypots, by the way, this is a 2-hour speak I usually give. I just took out 250 slides to make this one. And so here it gets into some of the geeky parts, and so you're not getting all the content on the geeky parts. But I want to just talk about some of the artifacts that we put into that deception layer that I showed you. So one of it is LABREA TARPITS. Its sole function is to slow the attacker down. That's what it does. It slows them down, and it trips alarms as it's slowing them down. And so you can start thinking about doing things. So if you see an IP address coming at you, you're slowing it down in the system, then you can redirect it, shunt it out to a VLAN. How cool is that? And then the attacker gets caught inside of those snares that you have in the VLAN. Honey ports is another area. So if you have to think about the ports and the functioning of your servers, the functioning of your artifacts, but you can take some of the ports, and if somebody starts scanning on ports that they shouldn't be getting into, again, it can trip off alarms, and it allows you to know where the person is coming from and who they are to some degree. I love this one. Infinitely recursive directory search. Highly complicated code. I mean, the code is just like highly complicated, but it allows what happens when the attacker's doing a directory search, it's infinitely recursive. And by the way, it's hard to stop. They have to kill the machine. Well, not kill it, but they have to turn the machine off. It doesn't stop forever. So like I said, very, very complicated code. That's it. That's the code for infinitely recursive directory search. You're basically having to go to dir 1 and then to dir 2, and dir 1 to dir 2. So that's it. By the way, I think probably everybody in this room could write that. And that's what it looks like. It will crash somebody's machine. It will light them up. But it certainly gives you a lot of, you know who these people are as they're coming at you. There's another artifact that's like this with infinitely recursive downloads. So somebody's starting to download a document, and they just continue to re-download the same document until their whole file structure gets filled up and they crash. So that's another one of the traps. Did I mention you talk to your lawyers first before you start doing this stuff? Okay, so something that you want to do. But this will definitely light up the attackers, and it's definitely a great tool to use when you start getting them, shunting them into your VLAN, and you know it's a valid attacker. Attribution is a really difficult thing. And my experience, and I've been doing this for a while, we really don't do a great job of attribution. Most attackers use anonymization to get to you. They use multiple hops to get to you. So attribution is very, very difficult. And like I tell my team, you don't look at whatever's coming into you from the outside as the actual attacker. They're using some sort of proxy. They're sitting behind multiple proxies. And you have to think about it from that perspective. So the key in attribution is doing something back. So if you have them inside of your deception layer and you have a Word dot or Word doc inside, so the honeypot or honey dot inside of a Word document, and they open up the document, that allows you to get attribution because now you're seeing their actual IP address. But even then, it's still iffy. So in the last election in the US, you guys weren't following that probably, there's this whole concept about the Russians hacking. Guys, I gotta tell you, the attribution in that is really, really difficult. So I don't know that how exact that was. I tend to think it wasn't that exact. So attribution is very important. Some of it is dealing with Tor, but Tor is only one of many. There's a really great article here that we can send back out to you. It's from Rob Gula. It talks about the Tor network. You can reverse engineer the Tor hops, so you can do that. It's work. Remember I said math is hard. Cybersecurity is hard work, but you can do it, and you can find the actual attacker through the multiple hops that they're using. So, That gets us to the end. Something like 2 hours worth of content, reduced significantly, so I don't know if I lost a whole bunch of content there, but there's room for a little bit of questions, I think 2 or 3 minutes. Any questions? If not, guys, this is about a paradigm shift. I wish you luck if you start doing this, but I think it's something we have to do as the defenders. We have to go through this paradigm shift. We have to start doing something different. Otherwise, we're going to get the same results that we see today. So thank you very much for your time.